evening is Hebrews 11, verse 23. Hebrews 11, verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith, Moses. If there was one person that the Jews held in higher esteem than Abraham, it was Moses. He was their great lawgiver. He had received the law on Mount Sinai from God himself. He had been their greatest prophet. He had spoken face to face with God. He had led them out of the bondage of Egypt. He had given them manna from heaven in the wilderness, and he had led them to the threshold of the promised land. And the Jews were zealous for Moses, and they were zealous for the law of Moses, for circumcision, the Passover feast, all the other feasts, and all the commandments written in the book of the law. And the Christians, to whom the apostle writes in Hebrews chapter 11, were being persecuted, they were hated, they were hunted down, and they were threatened with death itself because they were accused of forsaking Moses for the sake of Jesus Christ. The Jews were zealous for Moses. The Christians were zealous for a carpenter called Jesus of Nazareth, who had been crucified on a cross by the Romans. The Jews loved the law of Moses. The Christians were accused of forsaking the law of Moses, for being against circumcision and all the laws that God had given on Mount Sinai. The Jews believed in salvation by the works of the law, works, righteousness. That was the view of the Jews. You're saved by keeping the law. The Christians said, no, we're saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus Christ, the Messiah alone. And how fitting then, in Hebrews chapter 11, that we read, by faith, Moses. How fitting that the apostle writes to the Hebrews to remind them that Moses himself, the one who gave them the law, lived not by works, but by faith. We don't read by works, Moses, or by keeping the law, Moses, but by faith, Moses. Moses then appears prominent in the great cloud of faithful witnesses. And in fact, only Abraham has a larger chunk of Hebrews 11 devoted to him than Moses does. And this must have made an impression, a very deep impression, upon the Hebrew Christians to whom the apostle writes. The Hebrew Christians who were tempted and pressurized and persecuted into leaving Jesus Christ and going back to the old law of Moses. Go back to the law? Not even Moses was saved by the law. Not even Moses trusted in the law. He did not find salvation in the law. By faith, Moses. And that would be a great impression to the Hebrews. He found salvation in the promises of God centered on Jesus Christ. But before we come to Moses himself, by faith, Moses, we look at the faith of Moses' parents. Because without the faith of Moses' parents, we would not read about, by faith, Moses. And our text mentions the parents, but does not name them. Exodus 6 names them. Amram was Moses' father. And Amram means people of the highest. And Jochebed was Moses' mother, and her name means Jehovah is glorious. And only because they hid Moses by faith do we read in the rest of this chapter about by faith Moses. Consider then, Moses hidden by faith. Moses hidden by faith. Look, first of all, what was done, then why it was done, and finally how it was done. We need to look briefly at the background behind this by faith Moses was hidden. Amram and Jochebed were Hebrew slaves living at the time of the Egyptian bondage. Living at the time when Pharaoh had just decreed that all newborn baby boys would be cast into the river and killed. And at this point, Amram and Jochebed already had a family. They had two children. Miriam, who was by this point most likely a young teenager. She's described in Exodus chapter 2 as a maid, that is, one who is of marriageable age, a young girl, and also Aaron. And Aaron was at this point 3 years old. So here we have a family, Amram, Jochebed, a young girl, perhaps 11 or 12, and a 3-year-old boy. Miriam, of course, was saved from the decree of Pharaoh because she was a girl. Aaron was born before the decree of Pharaoh came into effect. But now we have a mixture of emotion in this household, because to these two godly Levite parents comes the news of a third child. And you can imagine Jochebed breaking the news to Amram. Amram, I'm pregnant again. On the one hand, we have joy and thanksgiving. God is going to give us another child. Every child is a blessing, and this one will be a blessing as well. But now the questions come. Is it a boy or is it a girl? And in those days you couldn't have a scan to find out would it be a boy or would it be a girl. You would only discover that on the day it was born. And if Pharaoh found out, that would be too late. Is it even safe for Amram and Jochebed to tell anyone at all that she is pregnant? What if an Egyptian hears about it? Will he or she not go and tell the authorities? Will they not be watched like a hawk until this child is born? Exodus 2 only mentions the actions of Jochebed, how she hid Moses and built for him an ark of bulrushes, but Hebrews 11 makes clear that both Amram and Jochebed were involved. Both of these parents had to explain to the other children what was happening, as much as they needed to know. Miriam would have been told a lot more than Aaron. Miriam's help would be invaluable later. Best not to tell Aaron very much. A 3-year-old boy would tend to talk. And Jochebed had to give birth to this child in secret. And provision had to be made to hide this child and to keep this child as quiet as possible. And if you're a parent tonight, imagine trying to keep a little baby boy as quiet as possible with a 3-year-old in the house at the same time. No easy thing to do. So here we have a situation. A godless government threatens the children of the church. Pharaoh was afraid that the church, the Israelites of that day, would grow to such an extent that they would be a threat to his national security. They would then take the side of some future enemy he feared. Best to kill all the boys so they could not join the army. Today, the governments of the world fear overpopulation. And increasingly, pressure is put upon the parents, including the parents of the church, to have fewer children. It's better for society, we are told, to have fewer children. It's better for the environment. The environmentalists say that to have many children increases your carbon footprint, if you believe in such nonsense. And if you are a mother with many children and you go to the supermarket with all of your children in tow, you can expect to get some strange looks in today's society. In fact, you can expect hostility from society. Large families are not appreciated in our society. The government threatens the children of the church. Our situation is not that far removed from Amram and Jochebed. But notice higher powers behind these events. Pharaoh has his reasons for this decree. Pharaoh was a cruel, paranoid king, totally depraved and filled with enmity against the people of God. But behind Pharaoh stands the evil one, the devil himself, tempting Pharaoh, urging him to do the devil's will, because the devil is very interested in the children of the church. And he was particularly interested in the children of Israel at this period in history because he understood the prophecy. Remember the prophecy of Genesis 3:15. God will send the seed of the woman, and the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. And the devil knows that the seed of the woman is going to come through the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so, the devil is targeting that line, especially the males of that line. Kill them all, and then Jesus Christ will not be able to come. That's the devil's purpose, to prevent the coming of Jesus Christ, who will be the destruction of the devil, ultimately on the cross. But God is sovereign over all of this as well. Remember what God says to Pharaoh himself in Exodus 9 verse 16. And in very deed, for this cause have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee. So God has raised up this evil man, Pharaoh, to this position of power so that God himself can show his power in Pharaoh. And God was the one, we sang about that this morning in Psalm 105, God was the one who turned the heart of the Egyptians against his people. He did this for several reasons. First, it was his purpose to make life in Egypt bitter and difficult for his people, so that his people would not be comfortable there, so that they would call out to him for deliverance. Because if they're comfortable in Egypt, they will never have the idea of leaving. Then he wants to make it humanly impossible for there to be any deliverance, so that all of the glory for that deliverance, when it eventually comes, will go to him. Plus, he wants to display before all the world the stubbornness and wickedness of this evil man Pharaoh, so that he can be justified in destroying him in the end. In this way, far from the seed of the woman being destroyed, which is what the devil is trying to achieve, the seed of the serpent, which is at this point Egypt working with the devil, that will be crushed under the seed of the woman. The seed of the woman will have a momentous victory over the seed of the serpent, especially in the 10 plagues and the destruction of Pharaoh and his host in the Red Sea. And that is how to understand Old Testament history. In the light of that first prophecy of the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, we have a cycle of bruisings. Sometimes the seed of the serpent bruises the heel of the seed of the woman. And then later, the seed of the woman bruises the head of the seed of the serpent. And this continues in a cycle throughout the whole of the Old Testament until finally the seed of the woman, Jesus Christ, destroys, crushes the head of the seed of the serpent, who is the devil himself. That's the background then to what happened with Jochebed and Amram. The text tells us that when he was born, or even when he was begotten, he was hidden. And that initial hiding occurred even before he was born. In that political climate, you could not make an announcement of a pregnancy. If the Egyptians had caught word of this pregnancy, the Amram household would have been put under surveillance until they found out what kind of child would be born into that Israelite home. So Jochebed can tell as few people as possible. Imagine that. You're an expectant mother. You're looking forward to having a child. You can't tell anyone. You don't know who it is safe to tell this secret to. Can you trust your neighbours? Can you trust those who you consider to be your friends? Can you trust your relatives? You don't know who might go telling it to the authorities. And then you have to give birth in secret. Perhaps in your one-room hut as a slave in Egypt. You have to give birth as quietly as possible. But God was with them. And undoubtedly, Amram and Jochebed planned all of this very carefully and prayed earnestly to God to give them help, to give them wisdom, to bless them in their endeavors. And if the pregnancy was difficult, the next 3 months were even more difficult. Amram and Jochebed were blessed with a beautiful boy. But there was no neighborly celebration. There were no cards and gifts sent to the household of Amram and Jochebed. There was no party to welcome this child into the world. Instead, there was tension. There was fear. In case someday this child might be seen or heard. Now we have in this small hut in Egypt an excitable 3-year-old boy who has to keep quiet about his new baby brother, staying at home with Jochebed and Miriam as Amram works all day as a slave for the Egyptians. The child had to be kept quiet. One cry, and it would be all over. Moses would be put to death, and his parents and family would no doubt be severely punished, if not killed. But whatever happens, Moses must not be heard. Amram and Jochebed are determined. They will not give up their baby boy. The Egyptians must not find out about him. Miriam and Aaron must tell no one about the fact that they have a baby boy. And this went on for 3 long months, day after day, week after week, month after month, hiding and praying and hoping that no one would hear. And after 3 months, we're told in Exodus chapter 2 that they could no longer hide him, and now comes in the second phase of their plan. Some commentators have imagined But at this point, the faith of Amram and Jochebed failed. They hid him for 3 months, and now they give up all hope. They simply abandon him to exposure, to die of hunger, or to be eaten by wild animals in the river Nile. But that interpretation does not do justice to the faith of Amram and Jochebed. Look at their careful planning. Jochebed made Moses a little ark from bulrushes. She waterproofed it with pitch and with slime. She placed him in a part of the river where the water was not fast moving, and she left Miriam there, a dependable girl, to watch, to see what would happen to him. Clearly, Jochebed has a plan, and her plan is not to leave Moses to die of hunger or exposure to the elements at the river. If that is your plan, you might as well just throw the child into the river and kill it quickly. From the outcome, it's obvious that there was a plan. It was not Amram and Jochebed's plan, it certainly was God's plan. But consider, they must have known that Pharaoh's daughter bathed regularly at this particular part of the river. It must have been a part free from crocodiles and other dangers. And she must have timed the placing of the baby there. No doubt she watched this place for weeks, if not months, and planned the time exactly when she put her baby into the river. She must have known also something about Pharaoh's daughter, that she would be favorably inclined to children, and would certainly have more compassion upon a little baby boy than her wicked father would. And the words of Miriam seem to be planned. They seem to be rehearsed. Would you like me to find for you a nurse of the Hebrew women to nurse this baby for you? Obviously, this was the outcome that Jochebed had prayed for. You can hear the prayer, as it were, in a little hut of Abraham and Jochebed. Lord, let our son find grace in the eyes of Pharaoh's daughter. And he did. And this too was in the providence of God. It was God's will for Moses, who would be the deliverer of God's people, that he be nursed by his mother for a time. And during that time, he would be taught the ways of God. And then, that he'd grow up in the household of Pharaoh. And there he would become, as Acts 7 verse 22 puts it, learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and mighty in words and in deeds. God had planned a great work for this Moses. And for that work, he required a good education. The best education that he could have in that day and age. He was going to be a leader. He was going to be the lawgiver of God's people. He was going to know how to read and write. Read and write the Pentateuch. And for this, God gives him an education, the best he could have in that day. And he gives him also godly parents who will teach him, for a few years anyway, the ways of the true God. He gave those godly parents, Amram and Jochebed, wisdom to hide Moses in his tender months. Two reasons the text gives us why this was done. And the first reason is they saw that he was a proper child. This word proper is a word used only of Moses in the New Testament scriptures. The basic idea of this word proper is beauty, whether physical beauty or the beauty of character. In Exodus 2 verse 2, the word is translated goodly. It's the common Hebrew word for good, or pleasant, or agreeable. In Acts 7 verse 20, he's called exceeding fair. Literally, good, or goodly, or proper to God. That word exceeding is to God. The idea there is of a child whose appearance and demeanour were pleasing to both God and man. Our text does not tell us, neither does Exodus tell us, what exactly Amram and Jochebed saw in him that caused him to appear goodly or proper in their sight. But whatever it was, they were determined to save him. Certainly, all children are proper and goodly and pleasing in the sight of godly parents. And just because someone is physically beautiful does not mean that he or she is or will be godly. Think, for example, of Absalom. He was, we are told, the most handsome man in Israel of his day. He turned out to be a wicked and ungodly son of David. Or think of God's words to Samuel, where he tells him that God does not look upon the outward appearance, but rather upon the heart. But Moses clearly had something extraordinary about him. Something in his appearance which betokened the favour of God. It would be futile for us to speculate what that was. Some commentators have said perhaps he was born with some kind of sign upon him which showed that God had something special in mind for him. Perhaps some kind of heavenly light radiated from his little face. Unlikely. Others have said that God must have given Amram and Jochebed a vision or a revelation of some kind, that this Moses was going to be the promised deliverer, destined for great things. Therefore, you must save him. But the Bible is silent about what exactly it was that caused him to be goodly or proper in their eyes. And we must be silent then, too. But Amram and Jochebed knew their calling. As godly parents, their calling was to protect all of their children from the evil one. They did not know what God's purpose was. They did know what their calling as parents is. And that's our calling as parents in the church today. We must see all of our children as proper and goodly children. We must raise them as proper and goodly children. We must do everything to protect them from the evil one as proper and goodly children. We do not know what they will turn out to be. We simply know our calling to protect them from the evil one. And so all of our children born into godly homes must be treated in this way. Received with love and thanksgiving from God and raised with care. Is a child born to Christian parents not physically proper and goodly? Is he deformed or handicapped in some way? Our calling is love him. Teach him the ways of God. Is a child difficult? Does he have a difficult temperament? Does he have behavioral problems? Our calling is care for him, love him, and by all means, discipline him. Are our children threatened by the state? Does the state mandate abortion in the name of population control? Does the state mandate the murder of handicapped children? Think Nazi Germany, for example. Does the state declare that many children are cursed and not a blessing. Our calling is to protect our children, to love our children, to have as many children as God will be pleased to give us. Because we believe, as Reformed parents, that all children are a blessing. That God never gives His children as a curse. Whether they are elect or reprobate, He gives them to His people as a blessing. And Amram and Jochebed did not argue this way. Well, we have two children. We've got Miriam and we've got Aaron. And now the Lord is giving us a third child. Let's just kill him. It's too risky to have a third child. It's too burdensome to have a third child. It would be better for him and for us if we just got rid of him. After all, what's the point of having him being born into this miserable existence as a slave in Egypt? But they did not say that. They trusted in God. They believed in God. They left the future to God. They lived according to God's commandments, not knowing what God's purpose finally would be. And of course, in the providence of God, we know that this child turned out to be the great deliverer of God's people. But they did not know that. And we do not know what our children will turn out to be either. Our calling is clear. Love our children. Protect them from the evil one. And if Amram and Jochebed had received divine revelation from God telling them, this son that I am giving you will turn out to be the next Pharaoh who will destroy the children of Israel. Still their calling would be to protect that child, and to love that child, and to teach that child the ways of God. And if God were to give you divine revelation, I speak as a fool, that your child was going to be the Antichrist himself, your calling would still be to love your child, to train up that child in the ways of God. Never would an abortion be lawful, even if you knew that your child would be the Antichrist himself. And because Amram and Jochebed saw their son as a goodly child, as a proper child, and protected him accordingly, Moses was preserved to be the deliverer of God's beleaguered people. Moses, remember, is destined for great things in the providence of God. And his miraculous preservation as a little child is part of this. No baby in the bulrushes, no 10 plagues, no Passover feast, no Exodus, no Mount Sinai, no wilderness wanderings, no conquest of Canaan. And God was pleased to use Amram and Jochebed and Miriam and Aaron and Pharaoh's daughter to accomplish His great purpose of redemption for His people, to keep His promise to send the seed of the woman of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and eventually to send Jesus Christ. They picture no baby in the bulrushes, no baby in the manger. No baby in the manger, no Christ on the cross, and no salvation for any of us this evening. And the instruction which his parents gave him as a little boy was also important in his development. God gave Jochebed the privilege of being his nurse in his tender years. And with his mother's milk, he received the word of God. Jochebed was paid in the providence of God, actually paid by the woman who was the daughter of the chief persecutor of the people of Israel, to look after Moses in his tender years. And you can imagine that Amram and Jochebed made the most of every moment of every day that they had him under their roof. They taught him the ways of God. They taught him about Jehovah God, the true God, as opposed to the gods of the Egyptians. They taught him about the fathers, about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They taught him about the promised land. They taught him about the seed of the woman, the promised deliverer. They taught him about the promise of salvation from Egypt. And they taught him that he himself had been miraculously delivered as a little boy from death. All of this would have made a lasting impression upon young Moses. And then the time came when he was a little boy. We don't know how old he was, when he had to leave his mother and his father and go and live in Pharaoh's house. And that instruction, which he had been given as a little boy, stayed with him. And as we'll see in the next verse of this chapter, eventually he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter and associated himself with the despised people of God. Why? Because he'd been taught this as a child. Certainly he was taught nothing about Jehovah in the schools of Pharaoh. The second reason for this hiding was that Amram and Jochebed did not fear the king's commandment. They knew the king's commandment. They knew what he had said that they must do, but they did not fear his commandment, and they did not fear him. And remember who this Pharaoh is. He is the most powerful leader of the world of that day, the leader of Egypt. He has life and he has death in his hands, or so he thinks. And what Amram and Jochebed did, therefore, was exceedingly risky. This is akin to hiding Jews from the Nazis in World War II. Pharaoh was utterly ruthless, and the Israelites were a despised minority in Egypt. They had no rights. There was no one in court who would argue for them, as Joseph had done many centuries before. And if Pharaoh had discovered what they were doing, he would have killed them or punished them very severely. And so with a mixture of wisdom and courage and much faith, they did what they knew they must do. And if they had been gripped by the fear of man, the fear of Pharaoh, they would not have obeyed God, but rather they would have obeyed the king. And that would have been the easy option, wouldn't it? Fear the king. Fear the king's commandment. That's the easy option, the soft option, the safe option. Do what the king, Pharaoh, says to do. But that would be the wicked, ungodly, disobedient option. And they could have argued that after all, what's the point? The risk is too high. Is it even worth it? Surely it's an exercise in futility, trying to hide a newborn baby boy from the Egyptian authorities. Better not even try it. What if we get caught? What good will it do Moses if we get caught? He'll be killed. We'll be killed, Miriam will be killed, Aaron will be killed. It's all a complete waste of time. They could have said too, let us do evil that good may come. Surely we're more used to God alive than dead. Even if we have to compromise our conscience a little bit, even if we have to sin, what's the point of dying a martyr? Let's just obey the king, and hopefully God will understand. But that was not how they reasoned. They did not fear the king's commandment because they feared someone higher. They feared God. And their natural fear of the king was driven out by their healthy and good fear of God. Nothing drives out the fear of man like a healthy fear of God. The fear of man is terror. The fear of God is awe and reverence in the sight of God. The fear that a son has for his father, all mixed with love and devotion. And that was Amram, and that was Jochebed. They feared God. They dreaded to displease God. They dreaded to lose the smile of his countenance upon them. They would not disobey God. Come what may, whatever the consequences might be, they will not disobey God. Rather die than disobey God. Because they knew that God was always with them. God was always watching them. God was always before them and behind them. And the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom and the very principle of godliness. And this fear of God, which characterized Amram and Jochebed, characterizes all believers. And this fear of God is not foolishness or foolhardiness. Amram and Jochebed did not make an announcement as soon as Moses was born. Look, we have a new baby boy, and then dare Pharaoh to kill them. That would have been foolishness. That would have been tempting God. But rather, in the fear of God, they would not obey the king. They hid Moses in the most difficult circumstances because they obeyed God, believed that God's law is higher than any man's law. They submitted to God's law and kept his commandments, were willing to suffer rather than disobey God in any particular. And how was it possible for them to do this? The answer, you will not be surprised to hear, is by faith. By faith is the recurring theme throughout Hebrews 11. And here we have again, by faith, which means by means of faith or through faith. And this godly Levite couple believed that God would do as he promised. And so they trusted in him for the welfare of their family. When these godly parents were at their wits' end, as it were, when devil-inspired cruelty threatened to swallow them and their children, when day and daily they dreaded the knock of the Egyptian on the door, they committed their way unto the Lord. They prayed. Earnest, agonizing, heartfelt, fervent prayer ascended from that humble dwelling in Egypt. Lord, help us. O God of our fathers, give us wisdom. Protect our son. And even though the situation seemed utterly hopeless and dire, they brought their troubles to God in prayer, and God heard them, and God answered them. He does not always answer as quickly as he did Amram and Jochebed, nor does he always answer in the way in which he answered Amram and Jochebed. But he promises, and he is faithful to do what he has said. And Jochebed and Amram believed in the coming deliverer who was promised, and by faith they acted as they did. God had promised to send a deliverer, the seed of the woman, who would destroy the devil and save God's people. And now they're in Egypt. And that promise seems further away than ever. In fact, it seems to be utterly impossible that such a promise could come true. At this point in the history of God's people, it seemed as if the seed of the serpent had its cruel foot on the neck of the seed of the woman. But no matter what things seem, faith is the evidence of things not seen. And the sovereign hand rules over Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is but a vessel fitted to destruction in Jehovah's almighty hand. And for godly believers, like Amram and Jochebed, God's promise is enough. Here's what God said to Abraham way back in Genesis 15. Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Amram and Jochebed could testify to the truth of that. In a strange land, afflicted 400 years. But there's more to the promise of Genesis 15. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward they shall come out with great substance. And Amram and Jochebed believed that too, that God would judge the nation that had afflicted Israel, that Israel would come out of that nation with great substance. It seemed incredible, it seemed utterly impossible, but Amram and Jochebed believed it. And in fact, through their godly actions of hiding their son Moses from Pharaoh, God was actually preparing the deliverance which he had promised. And so we see, beloved, what faithful witnesses Moses' parents were. They acted in faith. They believed in God's promises. Can we be like them? By God's grace, we can. And may God grant it with the power of His grace and Holy Spirit. Amen.